My wife cheated with my daughter's 18-year-old boyfriend. The fallout was devastating. Hello, read it. I never thought my life could unravel so quickly. I'm 42 years old, and up until a few months ago, I thought I had things figured out. My name is Matthew Carter, and I've spent most of my adult life building what I thought was a solid foundation for my family. I have a stable job in marketing, a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, and two daughters who mean the world to me. My oldest, Lily, just turned 18. My youngest, Emma, is 14 and still figuring out who she is. Between work and parenting, my days were full but predictable until everything fell apart. It started innocuously enough, as these things often do. I had no reason to suspect that my wife, Julia, would do something so devastating. We've been married for 20 years, and while things weren't perfect, I believed we had a good partnership. Julia was an attentive mother, a creative soul who spent her time painting and volunteering at the local community center. If you had asked me a few months ago, I would have said she was my rock, the glue that held our family together. Now I'm not sure if I ever really knew her at all. Looking back, the first cracks were subtle, almost unnoticeable. Julia became distant in small but persistent ways. She'd spend more time out of the house, claiming she needed a change of scenery for her art or that she was helping out with new community projects. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was busy with work. Lily was gearing up for her final year of high school, and Emma was immersed in her middle school drama. Life was hectic, and I figured Julia was just finding ways to decompress. But then there was Lily's boyfriend, Caleb. He was a polite, easygoing kid who'd been hanging around the house more and more over the past year. Lily met him during her junior year of high school, and they seemed happy together in that teenage first love kind of way. Caleb was the kind of boyfriend you'd hope your daughter would bring home. Respectful, good with his grades, and always willing to lend a hand with little things around the house. Julia even joked once that Caleb was too good to be true, but at the time I didn't think much of it. I laughed along and agreed that Lily was lucky to have found someone decent in a sea of rowdy teenagers. If only I had known what was brewing beneath the surface. The first red flag came on an otherwise uneventful afternoon. It was a Saturday, and the house was unusually quiet. Lily had gone out with friends, Emma was at a sleepover, and Julia was supposedly painting in the garage, her makeshift studio. I decided to take a break from catching up on work emails and head outside to grab a snack from the kitchen. As I passed by the garage, I heard voices, Julia's and Caleb's, unmistakably. They weren't arguing, but there was an edge to their conversation that caught my attention. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the door handle. Something about their tone made me uneasy, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Caleb had become a regular presence in our home, so it wasn't unusual for him to stop by, even when Lily wasn't around. Maybe Julia was just chatting with him about school or offering him advice about his future. She'd always been good at that, playing the role of the wise, supportive adult in our daughters' lives. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. When I walked into the garage, the air felt different. Caleb was sitting on a stool, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. Julia stood nearby, her arms crossed, a strained smile on her face. They both looked up when I entered, and for a split second, I saw something flicker across Caleb's expression. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Julia recovered quickly, her voice light and casual as she explained they'd been discussing his plans for college. I nodded, pretending to accept her explanation, but the unease in my chest didn't go away. That moment stuck with me in the days that followed. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that I was reading too much into an innocent situation. But then I started noticing other things. Julia seemed more preoccupied than usual, her phone glued to her hand at all hours. Caleb started showing up at odd times, even when Lily wasn't home, always with some excuse about returning a book or needing advice on a school project. Their interactions were always polite, always justifiable, but there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, what could possibly be going on between a 42-year-old woman and her teenage daughter's boyfriend? It was absurd. Julia had always been fiercely protective of Lily, and Caleb seemed like a good kid. The idea of anything inappropriate happening between them was unthinkable. And yet, the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, and I was getting ready for bed when I realized Julia wasn't in the house. She'd mentioned earlier that she needed some fresh air and planned to go for a quick walk. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but as the minutes ticked by and she still hadn't returned, I started to feel uneasy. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, scanning the quiet street for any sign of her. That was when I saw them. Julia and Caleb were standing in the shadows at the edge of the yard, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that sent a chill down my spine. They weren't touching, but the intimacy in their posture was unmistakable. Caleb leaned in slightly, his face inches from hers, while Julia's hand rested lightly on his arm. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation that didn't shatter the image I'd held of my wife and the life we'd built together. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before they noticed me. When they finally turned and saw me, the shock and panic on their faces confirmed what I had been trying so desperately to deny. This wasn't innocent. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a betrayal of the worst kind, one I never could have imagined. That night was the beginning of the end. And as I stood there in the cold, staring at the two people who had destroyed my trust, I realized my life was never going to be the same. That night felt like a blur of disbelief and rage. I barely remember walking back inside the house, my legs moving on autopilot as my mind scrambled to process what I had just seen. Julia and Caleb didn't follow me immediately, and I didn't wait around to see if they would. I slammed the door behind me and stumbled into the kitchen, gripping the counter as if it were the only thing keeping me upright. My hands shook with adrenaline as questions swirled in my head. How long had this been going on? Was this the first time, or had it started months ago under my nose? And most painfully, how could Julia do this? Not just to me, but to Lily? My thoughts felt like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Minutes passed before I heard the front door creak open. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body felt too heavy, too rooted in place, as Julia's footsteps approached cautiously. I could sense her hesitation, the way she lingered just out of reach, unsure of what to say or do. Caleb's absence was noticeable. She must have sent him away. For a fleeting moment, I hoped that she would offer some explanation, some shred of denial that might allow me to cling to the idea that I'd misinterpreted what I saw. But she said nothing. Her silence was deafening, and in it, I found my answer. That night, we didn't speak. I went to bed without a word, lying awake in the dark as Julia moved quietly through the house. I heard her footsteps pause outside the bedroom door, as if she were debating whether to come in, but eventually they faded. I wasn't sure where she spent the night, and I didn't care. All I knew was that the foundation of our family had been ripped out from under me, leaving a gaping void I couldn't begin to fill. The next morning, I avoided her entirely. I left early, using work as an excuse, though my focus was non-existent. I sat at my desk for hours, staring blankly at my computer screen as the events of the previous night replayed in my mind. Every detail felt sharper in the harsh light of day. The way Julia had leaned into Caleb, the look on their faces when they saw me, the unspoken betrayal that hung in the air. It was all too vivid, too real. By the time I returned home, I had hoped to find some clarity, but the tension in the house was suffocating. Julia hovered near the kitchen, her movements hesitant and uncertain, while Lily chattered on the couch about her day at school. Seeing her so happy, so unaware of the storm brewing around her, made my chest ache. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I figured out how to handle this without shattering her world. Over the next few days, the cracks in our family life widened. Julia and I barely spoke, our once comfortable routine replaced with strained silence and unspoken resentment. I couldn't look at her without seeing Caleb, without replaying the moment that had upended everything. And yet, despite the anger simmering beneath the surface, I still felt an overwhelming need for answers. I couldn't move forward, couldn't even begin to decide what to do, until I knew the full extent of her betrayal. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, while Julia was out running errands, I found her laptop open on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the situation felt too convenient to ignore. My gut told me this wasn't just coincidence. It was a chance to confirm what I already suspected. I hesitated for only a moment before sitting down and opening her email. At first, there was nothing unusual. Messages from friends, community center updates, even an online receipt for art supplies. But as I scrolled further, I stumbled across a folder labeled Drafts. It wasn't a folder Julia typically used, and curiosity got the better of me. When I opened it, my heart sank. There were several unsent emails addressed to Caleb. Most were brief and cryptic, referencing plans to meet up or moments they'd shared. But one message, dated weeks ago, stopped me cold. In it, Julia described feeling alive for the first time in years, how Caleb had brought something back in her life that she hadn't realized was missing. She wrote about their connection, how she hadn't planned for things to go this far, but couldn't stop herself. It was a confession of everything I had feared. Reading those words felt like a second betrayal. It wasn't just a physical affair. It was emotional, too. She had chosen him, a boy barely out of high school, over the family we had built together. And worst of all, she had taken something from Lily that could never be replaced. Her trust, her first love, her sense of security in the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen as waves of anger, sadness, and disbelief washed over me. When Julia came home that night, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. I needed more time to think, to plan, to decide how to handle the mess she had created. In the days that followed, I began to piece together a clearer picture of what had happened. Caleb's sudden closeness to Julia hadn't been a coincidence. It had been intentional, a gradual erosion of boundaries that I had failed to see until it was too late. Their affair had likely begun months ago, hidden in plain sight under the guise of casual conversation and shared jokes. Every interaction I had once dismissed as harmless now felt like a glaring red flag I had chosen to ignore. As the truth came into focus, so did my next steps. I couldn't keep this to myself forever, but I also couldn't let my anger dictate my actions. I had to think about Lily, about how this revelation would affect her, about how to minimize the damage Julia had already caused. The thought of her finding out made my chest tighten, but I knew it was inevitable. Secrets like this don't stay buried for long. What I didn't realize was just how soon the truth would come out, or how devastating the fallout would be. The days after uncovering Julia's emails were some of the longest of my life. Each moment felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a pit of chaos, knowing that one wrong step would send everything crashing down. Every time I saw Lily, my guilt deepened. I was her father, the person who was supposed to protect her, yet I was holding onto a secret that would devastate her. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on me relentlessly, and I knew I couldn't keep it to myself much longer. Julia, on the other hand, carried on as though nothing had happened. It was almost impressive how effortlessly she maintained a facade of normalcy, chatting with Lily about college applications, laughing at Emma's middle school antics, and even trying to make small talk with me. Her calm demeanor infuriated me, but it also made one thing clear. She wasn't going to confess. If the truth was going to come out, it would be up to me to reveal it. But how? How do you tell your daughter that her mother, the woman she trusts most in the world, has betrayed her in the worst way imaginable? How do you shatter someone's perception of their family and expect them to recover? The questions kept me awake at night, my thoughts racing in circles as I wrestled with the enormity of what lay ahead. Then, one evening, everything came to a head. It was a Friday, and Lily had invited Caleb over for dinner. I had debated saying no, but I knew that would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. Besides, part of me wanted to see him, to confront him, if only in the subtlest of ways. If Julia could act normal around him, so could I. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The atmosphere at the dinner table was strained, though Lily didn't seem to notice. She was too busy gushing about her day, filling the silence with stories about her friends and the latest drama at school. Emma chimed in occasionally, but I could tell she was more focused on her plate than the conversation. Julia, as usual, played the role of the attentive mother, smiling and nodding at all the right moments. Caleb, meanwhile, sat across from me, his face a carefully constructed mask of politeness. But I could see the cracks, the nervous way he avoided my gaze, the way his hands fidgeted slightly with his fork. He knew. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to grab something from the kitchen, needing a moment to collect my thoughts. As I stood by the counter, staring blankly at the fridge, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. Caleb's voice, low but distinct, drifted into the kitchen. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his tone laced with unease. I couldn't make out Julia's reply, but her response was enough to make him fall silent. The implication was clear. They were still in contact, still conspiring behind Lily's back, even as they sat across the table from her. I clenched my fists, the urge to storm back into the dining room nearly overwhelming me. But I held back, knowing that an impulsive confrontation would only make things worse. Instead, I waited until dinner was over, watching every interaction like a hawk. The way Julia's gaze lingered on Caleb, the way his smile faltered under the weight of her attention. It was all there, laid bare in front of me. And Lily had no idea. That night, after Caleb left and the girls were in their rooms, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The time for silence was over. Julia was in the living room, scrolling through her phone, when I walked in and sat across from her. She looked up, her expression guarded, as if she could sense what was coming. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Instead, I laid out everything I knew, the emails, the motel, the conversation I'd overheard. I watched as her calm exterior cracked, the color draining from her face as the weight of her actions came crashing down. She didn't try to deny it. How could she? The evidence was irrefutable, and we both knew it. Her excuses, when they came, were as hollow as I expected. She talked about feeling neglected, about wanting to feel desired again, about how Caleb had been there for her in ways she hadn't realized she needed. Every word felt like a knife, cutting deeper into the trust one had once placed in her. But the worst part wasn't her betrayal of me. It was her betrayal of Lily. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and no amount of justification could change that. The conversation ended with an ultimatum. I told her she had until the weekend to come clean to Lily. If she didn't, I would. The look on her face was one of sheer panic, but I didn't care. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. The next day passed in a haze of tension. Julia spent most of it holed up in the bedroom, avoiding both me and the girls. I tried to act normal for their sake, but every moment felt like walking on eggshells, waiting for the inevitable fallout. By the time evening rolled around, my patience was wearing thin. If Julia wasn't going to act, I would. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. That night, while Julia was still hiding upstairs, Lily knocked on my office door. She looked nervous, her hands twisting together in a way that reminded me of when she was a little girl. I asked her what was wrong, and her response sent a chill down my spine. "Is there something going on with Mom and Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I had been so focused on protecting her from the truth that I hadn't considered the possibility that she might already suspect it. And now, as I looked in her eyes, I realized that the moment I had been dreading was already here. I took a deep breath, bracing myself for what was to come. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. Lily's question had been the dam breaking. Once I told her the truth, there was no holding back the flood that followed. Her devastation was immediate and raw, tears and anger intertwining in a storm that I could barely withstand. But what happened next wasn't just emotional fallout. The truth didn't just live within our home anymore. It began to spread. The next day at school, Lily confided in her best friend Emma. By lunchtime, the whispers had started. By the time the school day was over, Lily's phone was flooded with texts from classmates who had heard about her boyfriend's betrayal and her mother's involvement. What had been a family secret only hours earlier was now public knowledge. And in the cruel world of high school gossip, nothing stays private for long. That evening, I came home to find Lily in her room, sobbing over her phone. Julia was in the guest room, avoiding the fallout entirely. The tension in the house felt suffocating, and I knew it couldn't go on like this. Caleb had already texted Lily, blaming her for blowing things out of proportion and ruining everything. He even had the audacity to suggest that she owed him an apology. I could feel my blood boiling with every word she read to me. But what tipped everything over the edge was what Lily showed me next. Caleb had sent her a screenshot of a text from Julia, a desperate plea for him to talk to her, to figure this out. Even after everything, Julia was still trying to maintain contact with him. Any sympathy I might have had for her shattered in that moment. She wasn't just complicit, she was actively making it worse. I stormed into the guest room, holding up Lily's phone. Julia barely looked at me before she started crying, saying she was overwhelmed and didn't know how to handle the fallout. She claimed she had only reached out to Caleb because she thought he might be able to calm Lily down, but I didn't believe her for a second. This wasn't about Lily. It was about her trying to cling to the disaster she had created. By the time the argument ended, it was clear that Julia and I couldn't continue living under the same roof. I told her she needed to leave, at least for the time being. She protested, saying she didn't want to abandon the girls. But I reminded her that she had already done irreparable damage to them. Staying here would only make things worse. The next morning, Julia packed a bag and left. I told the girls that she was staying with a friend for a while, but Lily wasn't fooled. She knew why her mother was gone, and though she didn't say it out loud, I could tell she was relieved. With Julia gone, I turned my attention to Caleb. He had been quiet since his last barrage of texts, but I wasn't naive enough to think he'd let things go. Sure enough, I received a call from his mother later that day. She was furious, demanding to know why I was spreading lies about her son. She insisted that Caleb had done nothing wrong, that Julia was the one who had pursued him, and that it wasn't fair to blame him for what had happened. Her words were dripping with self-righteousness, and I could tell she believed every single one of them. I cut her off mid-sentence, telling her that I had no interest in arguing. The facts spoke for themselves. I told her to keep Caleb away from my family, and hung up before she could respond. It wasn't the most diplomatic move, but I was beyond caring. My priority was protecting Lily and Emma from any further damage. But just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the situation took another turn. 2 days later, Lily came to me with a confession. Someone at school had posted about the affair on social media, and it had gone viral. The post included details about Caleb's relationship with Julia, as well as screenshots of texts Lily had shared with a close friend. It wasn't hard to figure out who was behind it. Lily's friend had betrayed her trust, spreading the story like wildfire for the sake of drama. Now, everyone in town knew about the scandal. The fallout was immediate. The post was taken down within hours, but the damage was already done. Parents were calling the school, demanding answers. Caleb's soccer coach benched him indefinitely, citing conduct unbecoming of an athlete. Julia, who had only just started staying at a friend's house, was forced to resign from her volunteer position at the community center. Even Emma, who had been blissfully unaware of most of the situation, came home in tears after hearing whispers about her mother in the school hallway. The public humiliation hit Julia harder than anything else. She called me, sobbing, begging to come home so we could face this as a family. I told her in no uncertain terms that she had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. She accused me of being heartless, of turning the girls against her, but I refused to engage. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting my daughters. Lily, for her part, was surprisingly resilient. She deleted her social media accounts, cut ties with the so-called friends who had betrayed her, and focused on rebuilding her life without Caleb. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, but I could see her growing stronger in the face of adversity. She told me once that she had learned something important from all of this, that some people aren't who they seem, no matter how much you want to believe otherwise. As for me, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Julia's betrayal had left scars on all of us, and it would take time to heal. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. My family might never be the same, but we were still standing. And for now, that was enough. The aftermath of the scandal reshaped our lives in ways I could never have imagined. With Julia gone and Caleb permanently out of the picture, the house felt emptier, but also calmer. There was no longer the heavy cloud of secrecy hanging over us, no lies lurking beneath the surface. Instead, there was the slow, difficult process of rebuilding, both as individuals and as a family. Julia didn't return home. After her resignation from the community center and the fallout at school, she decided to leave town entirely. She moved in with her sister in another state, though I never told the girls exactly where. It was better that way, cleaner, less complicated. Lily refused to speak to her, and even Emma, who had always idolized her mother, seemed unsure of how to process the betrayal. I let the girls take the lead, respecting their boundaries while trying to be the steady presence they needed. In Julia's absence, I focused on creating a sense of normalcy for the girls. I threw myself into the routines of parenting, helping Lily with college applications, driving Emma to soccer practice, making dinners that usually ended with all three of us laughing over something silly. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when the hurt bubbled to the surface, when the silence in the house felt too heavy, but it was progress. We were moving forward, one step at a time. Lily, in particular, surprised me with her resilience. After the social media post went viral, she had every reason to crumble, but she didn't. She deleted her accounts, distanced herself from the toxic friendships that had betrayed her, and poured her energy into school and her future. There were still bad days, of course, moments when I'd hear her crying softly in her room, or when she'd get quiet at the mention of Caleb's name. But those moments became fewer and farther between. Over time, she started to rediscover herself outside of the shadow of the betrayal. Emma, on the other hand, struggled more. At 14, she didn't fully understand the complexity of what had happened, but she felt the weight of it nonetheless. She asked questions I wasn't always prepared to answer, questions about loyalty, love, and why people hurt the ones they're supposed to protect. I did my best to reassure her, to remind her that what Julia had done didn't define the love we still had as a family. But it was clear the situation had left its mark on her. She became more withdrawn, more hesitant to trust, and it broke my heart to see her innocence chipped away so young. As for me, I spent a lot of time reflecting on how we had gotten to this point. It was easy to place all the blame on Julia. After all, she had been the one to cross the line, to betray the trust we had built over 2 decades. But part of me couldn't help but wonder if I had missed the signs, if I had contributed to the distance that had grown between us. I wasn't excusing her choices. I knew she alone was responsible for what she had done, but I couldn't stop myself from questioning whether I could have prevented it somehow. The final confrontation with Julia came a few months later, when she returned briefly to finalize our divorce. She wanted to meet with the girls, to try to explain herself and repair the relationship, but Lily refused outright. Emma agreed to see her, but the meeting was strained and awkward. Julia apologized repeatedly, tears streaming down her face, but Emma's responses were short and guarded. When Julia left that day, I could see the pain in her eyes, the realization that her actions had cost her the family she had once held so dear. The divorce itself was straightforward. There was no drawn-out legal battle, no fight over assets or custody. Julia knew she didn't have much ground to stand on, and she didn't try to contest anything. By the end of it, the only thing tying us together was the years of shared history that now felt like a distant memory. With the legalities behind us, I felt an odd sense of closure. The chapter with Julia was over, and while the scars of her betrayal would always remain, I was ready to move on. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, whether I'd ever trust someone enough to let them into my life again. But for now, my focus was on the girls. They were my priority, my anchor, and my reason for moving forward. Life eventually settled into a new rhythm. Lily graduated high school and was accepted into a college a few hours away. Watching her thrive, despite everything she had endured, was one of the proudest moments of my life. Emma started therapy to help process her emotions, and over time, I could see her beginning to open up again. She even joined a new soccer team, making friends who reminded her of what it meant to trust and connect with others. As for Julia, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was struggling to rebuild her life. She had tried to rekindle a relationship with her sister, but had found it difficult to escape the shadow of what had happened. Part of me felt sorry for her, but I knew that pity wouldn't change anything. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Looking back, I still don't fully understand how everything unraveled the way it did. There's no easy way to reconcile the life we had before with the pain and chaos that followed. But what I do know is this: betrayal doesn't have to define you. It can break you, yes, but it can also force you to rebuild, to reevaluate what matters, and to find strength in places you never thought to look. For me, that strength came from Lily and Emma. They reminded me that even in the face of heartbreak, there's still love to be found, still joy to be shared. And as we continue to move forward, I hold on to the hope that we can create a life that's not defined by what we've lost, but by what we still have.